Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today you should probably be in Luke chapter 16. We'll be in verses 19 through 31, dealing with the story, of the Rich Man and Lazarus. Now, happy Easter, I get to say. That's written in my notes, because I'm going to be preaching this on Easter Sunday. Unlike stuff like Christmas, which is completely unfounded, the date of Jesus' death and resurrection is actually pretty close to around the Easter time frame. We Christians based Easter off of around when the Jewish Passover is happening, and that was around when Jesus died, and so this is probably a pretty accurate point in time around which Jesus died. Christmas is just a guess, and honestly, if it was December 25th, the shepherds would not be standing out in the fields at nighttime, because it would be rather cold. They wouldn't be doing that. Anyway, that's a whole different point. The point is, this is around the time Jesus died and rose again, about 2,000 years ago. Close, 1900 and something years ago. So, many happy returns, and who knows how many more we will have, but however many there is, that's fine by me. God knows what he's doing and when he's doing it, and that'll work out. All of that is to say, you have to kind of acknowledge that Easter happened, and then I can just move around it and say, this is not a resurrection sermon. I know a lot of preachers who will organize some of their preaching around different dates, like holidays, right? Mother's Day comes up and you have to talk about mothers, or Father's Day comes up and everybody kind of forgets about that one, or some other, Christmas comes up and, well, you have to talk about Jesus' birth or whatever it is, just because people are on the same wavelength, even if it's not a holiday you agree with, like Christmas it's not Jesus' actual birthday, but since people are thinking about it, you may as well preach on Jesus' birth or something like that. I'm not really one of those guys, and so this is not really a resurrection sermon. Closest I can do for you is this is a story about death and the afterlife, which is a kind of resurrection, so maybe that counts. And if it doesn't count, then, oh well, I don't really care. Luke 16, verses 19 through 31 is the story where Jesus tells a story of what's usually called the Rich Man and Lazarus, something like this. Some people call it the parable of the Rich Man and Lazarus. Some people just call it the Rich Man and Lazarus. And there's a reason for that, but we'll dive into that as we get there. The context of this chapter is that Jesus is teaching his disciples. It says so in chapter 16 and verse 1, Luke 16. He's been talking to tax collectors and sinners in Luke 15 and verse 1, and he's explaining to them about, salvation and how God is rejoicing over the sinners who repent. He starts talking in that same kind of context, but he takes an aside to his disciples in chapter 16 and verse 1, starts talking to them about your focus and the things that you should be looking forward to. He tells a couple of stories there, and again, we'll talk more about story versus parable a little bit later. It's in verse 14, though. Jesus was talking about being wise with your money, and he ends off with this idea in verse 13, chapter 16, verse 13. You can't serve two masters. You're going to serve the one and love the other, or you're going to, be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. It's the same warning that we looked at a little bit ago in Matthew chapter 6, with Jesus in Matthew 6 verse 24, I think it is. No one can serve two masters. It's that same idea, and he's bringing it up in this context because it is relevant. So he ends with that same warning as the Sermon on the Mount. But this time he has a little bit of a different audience. As the disciples, he's teaching the disciples specifically, but as he's teaching these people, others can also hear him. And there are Pharisees around the area who, in verse 14, they're lovers of money. They're listening to what Jesus says, and they start mocking Jesus. These are people who are very affluent. They have so much. They are well supplied. And they start laughing at what Jesus says because obviously Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about. Jesus speaks back up to them in verses 15 down through 18, correcting them a little bit and poking some holes in their theology before he opens up with verse 19. And verse 19 is very interesting because it talks about a rich man who's doing very well for himself, and then a poor man outside his gate whom the rich man never helps at all. The rich man keeps everything for himself. The poor man suffers and ultimately dies. The rich man, when he dies, well, he also dies, and then there are consequences for that. You Pharisees, who are lovers of money, who do so much to burden all these people, you burden the poor, and then you won't help them. You won't help them mitigate that. You won't help them deal with it. You just shove your weight on them, and then expect them to deal with it. Well, suddenly, maybe you guys should be learning something from the story of the rich man and Lazarus. This is part of Jesus' rebuke to the Pharisees. And it goes a little like this. Luke 16, starting in verse 19. Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, enjoying himself in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed from the scraps which fell from the rich man's table. Not only that, the dogs also were coming and licking his sores. Now it happened that the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's arms, and the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades he raised his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus in his arms. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set, so that those who want to go over from here to you will not be able, nor will any people cross over from there to us. And he said, Then I request of you, Father, that you send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment as well. That's very important. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to him, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. The rich man and Lazarus, what do you do with that? First, you need to figure out exactly what Jesus is talking about. And the big question that always arises here is people start asking, is this a parable or is this a real story? If you haven't heard that question before, a lot of people like asking that because it does, to be fair, change a bit of what you're talking about. And we'll talk about some of the changes and the differences later on. Point being, for now, try to discern between these two. Is this a parable Jesus is telling, or is this a real story? A parable is typically defined as something like an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, as in Jesus tells something that we can relate to, and then we can make some application from that over to heaven and the spiritual reality. And so that's usually what a parable is. And a lot of times parables come with a specific type of interpretation, and so that is one thing. On the other hand, parables are just kind of made-up stories where Jesus is illustrating something to make a point. A real story, if Jesus is telling this like it's a historical account, like it's something that actually happened, then that's a little bit different, and that can inform some different things. We'll explore that a little later on. To differentiate between the two, well, actually, I think I might rearrange that. Hold on. Part of the type of prototyping these sermons and giving them while I'm here is that I get an opportunity to rearrange some things, and I just realized the way I wrote this down doesn't really make any sense. Let's talk about the differences, like what it would mean for it to be a parable versus being a story, and then when I discuss why you might believe it's a parable or why you might believe it's a story, when I go over a couple points about that, maybe that'll make a little more sense as to why we have to talk about that. Does it really change anything whether this is a parable or a real story, like a historical account that actually happened? In something like the sower, right? The sower parable, it really doesn't change anything at all. A sower went out to sow, and he threw the seed all over the ground. Some of it worked out, some of it didn't. You know, that can be bobbed down the road, or that can be a completely made-up story, and it doesn't really matter because it illustrates the same thing. Like, there's no big difference here. For the rich man and Lazarus, it does change quite a bit if this is a real story, like a real thing that happened, and not just a parable Jesus is inventing. Because if this is a parable, then this is not like a literal picture of the afterlife. The rich man and Lazarus, part of it does take place on earth, but a lot of it takes place after the death of both of them and the consequences they suffer. If this is a real story, this is Jesus revealing what has happened to a couple of people after they have died, which is kind of significant, isn't it? This is also a literal picture of what's happening behind the scenes. When you die, you're going to end up like the rich man or like Lazarus. You're going to end up in that same kind of circumstance. And that's a very different feeling. If this is a true story, then it is, it's very literal. If this is just a parable, this isn't how the afterlife works. But even with that, we kind of need to pull back our assumption a little bit still. If this is a parable, this is not a literal picture of the afterlife. So if you base your theology on the idea that there is Hades versus Abraham's bosom, and that's kind of where you're going to go in the waiting room kind of period before heaven and hell, that is going to inform your theology on what you believe is going to happen when you die. And even though, in a lot of ways, when we bring this back around, we're going to agree on a bunch of the core points, but we're going to think it looks very different after death. That can inform some of what you think and some of how you think life is going to end. So, if it is a literal picture of the afterlife, that ends up being very important. However, if this story is a parable, then it's not a literal picture of the afterlife. And if this story is a true story, then I would say it still doesn't have to be a literal picture of the afterlife. Because, again, this story is basically about a waiting room before people get into heaven and hell. Hades is not hell. Hades is just the realm of the dead, and Abraham's bosom is not heaven, right? It's the place where Abraham is, but it's not heaven with God. He's with Abraham, and Abraham is apparently the greatest being there. This story, yeah, it talks about this kind of waiting room before people get into heaven, but this story is also happening while Jesus is walking around on the earth, and after this, Jesus will die and rise again, which, sets forth his blood to be a cleansing agent for people throughout all of time and space, for anyone who is faithful, so that they can access heaven finally, because as the Old Testament says, the blood of bulls and goats, or as Hebrews says, the bulls and goats blood sacrifices from the Old Testament don't really solve everything that they should. They don't really solve anything, actually. They don't forgive any sins. They're just kind of there so God can overlook sins for the moment. But Jesus' sacrifice is the one thing that really saves, and it's Jesus' sacrifice that purifies people for all of time. The old-timey American way to say that is the blood of the cross flows both ways. It flows backwards to the faithful Hebrews who used to exist, and it flows forward to the faithful Christians who will exist throughout the future. I don't know about the technical phrasing of that statement. I'm not going to nitpick that here. All I'm here to say is, look, Jesus' death changed some things about how salvation works. I wouldn't be surprised if it also changed things about how a waiting room in heaven worked. Even if Jesus is telling a story and it's literally true, that there is Hades and there is Abraham's bosom and people are waiting there, Jesus then goes and dies and resurrects, his blood becoming a bridge to allow people into heaven. I feel like the waiting room idea is done at that point. I don't know. I could be wrong about that because, again, I don't know exactly how the afterlife looks like, but I wouldn't hinge my theology on the afterlife on the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Even if it is a true story, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. Some people will argue with that. You can argue with that if you want to. Either way, whatever, because we're going to come around to the same basic points at the end. If we were to talk about the differences and why some people believe this is a parable and some people believe it's just a story, we can do it in a few different parts. Number one, parables often begin with a note. If you go back to chapter 15 in verse 3, it says, Jesus told them this parable, saying, boom, and then he tells them a parable. If you go through a lot of parables, most of the parables end up being like this. When you open chapter 16 and verse 19, Jesus is just kind of talking. He's talking about divorce and adultery and don't marry a divorced woman, verse 18, and then he just says, there's a rich man, and he just kind of moves on. If this is a parable, it is kind of odd that this story doesn't start out with saying, and he told them a parable. That being said, it could indicate that this really happened. Maybe it's a true story. Some people believe that. On the other hand, go back to 16 and verse 1. Now he was also saying to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering possessions, yada, yada, yada. And he tells them a story. But everybody calls that, the parable of the unrighteous steward. So it seems kind of inconsistent to say, well, 16:19 doesn't say a parable, therefore it's a true story. But I don't think anybody actually believes that 16:1 actually happened. I don't think anyone believes Jesus is telling them a real, true historical story that really happened. And so just take that into account, right? Treat that fairly, and just because it has an introduction, or it doesn't have an introduction, it doesn't mean it's not a parable. It just means Luke didn't call it specifically a parable, and that can be fine. Another conclusion people come to is this is the only parable that seems to use an actual person's name most of the time. It's the sower who went out to sow, or even the rich man had an unjust steward or an unrighteous steward from chapter 16 and verse 1. Whereas here in 16 verse 19 and 20, there's a rich man and there's Lazarus. This would be the only parable that we know of that has a human being's name actually recorded in it. And so for that reason, some people believe that it's a true story, not just an invented parable. To that reason, I also say, just because I add a name into something doesn't mean it's a true story. Frodo, Sam, Aragorn, they're all names, but Lord of the Rings did not actually happen. Right, and maybe you can argue that that is a little bit different because, that's clearly a fictional story. Maybe it's not even a fictional story, and it has a real person's name in it. There are a lot of books with real people's names in it that are not real stories. They did not actually happen, but they're used as examples. And so that doesn't hold up to me. It is an oddity, I will grant you that. A name is very much an oddity in this story, but it's not an impossibility in Jesus' parables. Also, keep in mind, we only have a small sampling of Jesus' parables. I don't know how many he told. I don't know how much stuff he did. I don't know how many parables he might have told or how many renditions of the sower he told with a person's name in it. Maybe he told none. Maybe he told a lot. We just have no idea. So arguing that just because it has a name, it's a real story, doesn't really hold water for me, but I know it convinces some people. The third thing, and the most convincing of these three, would be that this really isn't an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. When we say parable, I think I already said this, it's an earthly story. It's something we can relate to and something like we experience, right? Sowers, or a woman baking bread, or a man going out to fish, right? It's stuff that happens here on the earth that we understand, and we have that real reference point, the physical reference point, to then draw some spiritual application. Whereas with Luke 16, it's about two people dying and then going to the afterlife. And we don't have that kind of context, right? I have not died and gone to the afterlife, seen what it's like, and then been back. I can't make the application in that same way. It's not an earthly story. It's not really an earthly story. And it does have a heavenly meaning, but it's not really an earthly story. And so there is a question on that. It does start with people, but it moves into the spiritual realm, and that's not what normal parables do. At the same time, you could argue that there is a deeper spiritual meaning to the story, and even the real point of the story is not Hades versus Abraham's bosom. It's about two people's reactions to death. And so you could argue it really is, even though we don't have an exact parallel for it on earth, we still seek a deeper spiritual meaning, and we can still find a deeper spiritual meaning. So it's not really an earthly story, but it does have the heavenly meaning. At the same time, that's not the greatest defense. Personally, I don't really care that it's not called a parable. I definitely don't care that Lazarus' name is used. It is weird, I'll grant you that, but that's it. It's not that weird or shocking to me. This one does give me a little bit of a hang-up, because it is definitely not like any other parable that we have written down. Again, Jesus may have told others that we have no record of that were more like this. I have no idea, but that one does give me pause. At the same time, I think it's probably a parable, That's what I go with. But I understand how people see it as a story, even if I don't agree with most of the reasons for that. I do understand why people would get there. The point is, if this is a parable, it's a highly unusual parable. The point is also, if this is a true story, it's a highly unusual true story. This would be like the only story we have about the waiting room period, about people who die. God talks about Judgment Day and heaven and hell in a lot of places. This is like the only time we're talking about Hades versus Abraham's bosom, a waiting period, an in-between place before you actually hit Judgment Day proper. This is just a weird story in general. And so, what do you do with that? Ultimately, whatever kind of story, fake story or real story this section is, it's very unusual. We don't get the reveal of the technical workings of the afterlife unless this is it. Which is kind of a weird way to talk about it, but, God can do whatever he wants to do. I think the main point of this section and why we need to address it is we can't know for certain that this is literally how the afterlife works. We can't know that for certain back in Jesus' day when he spoke that. If this is a parable, it's not a literal story. If this is a true story, then it is a true story before Jesus' death and resurrection. And so even if it was true before Jesus' death and resurrection, I don't know that it's still true now. And I would argue it's probably not still literally true in the same way, right? I don't think there's a waiting period anymore. People disagree with me. A lot of people disagree with me based on the Rich Man and Lazarus. But I think Jesus' death and resurrection has shuffled things in that realm enough that I wouldn't rely on this to be a literal representation of what happens. That being said, it doesn't really matter, because the same basic points can be grasped, whether you believe this is the literal truth of what's happening, or it's just kind of a metaphorical representation. The Rich Man and Lazarus is not built to get us into a debate on literal story versus parable. The Rich Man and Lazarus is told to tell us something about death, and whether this is something that real human beings went through, or this is something that Jesus is just using to illustrate the points, I don't know, I don't care, and it doesn't ultimately change the points that are made. We can agree, and we should end up agreeing on these 7 important truths about death, which is where the real point, the real heart of the sermon comes in. Here are 7 important things about death. Number 1, all people die. Verse 22, there's a rich man, there is Lazarus. Lazarus is poor, the rich man is rich. Incredible distinction. You have 2 people, but ultimately both of them meet the same fate. You can be rich or poor. Guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to die. I was going to say you're probably going to die, but that kind of undermines the point Jesus is making. You're going to die. You can be young or you can be old. Guess what? You're going to die at some point. We don't know exactly when. Not everybody dies at the same age, but it's going to happen. You can be righteous or you can be unrighteous, and you're going to die at some point. Everyone is going to die. Death is, as they say, the great equalizer. You cannot escape reality. All people will end up at this point. That is final. There is no way out. Get used to it. There is a sorrow in that. It means that no matter how great you are or how much you do to help other people or how beneficial you are for society or whoever it is, you're still going to die. So that's wonderful. There is kind of a sorrow and a loss in that. At the same time, there is comfort in it. No matter how evil someone is, no matter how well supplied they are, no matter how much they hurt people to get all this money to then provide for themselves the cushy lifestyle or whatever it is, they're going to die too. And so there's comfort in that. It's even if you lose everything, hey, at the end, everybody loses everything. And there's a kind of comfort in that equality. We all come from God, and we all go back to God. Exactly. I'm not exactly sure how theologically accurate coming from God is. In a sense, you can take that in totally the wrong way, or you can take it in the way I meant, which is not the wrong way, but there you go. Do with that information what you will. However that phrase came across is whatever. There is comfort in it, in death. If we all die, right? Job said, here's a better way to say it. Job said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. I didn't come with anything. I'm not going to go with anything. And at the end, we're all just human beings who were born on the world. We're all human beings who lived some amount of time on the world. Some people very, very little. Some people much, much too long. And at the end, we're all going to go right back to having nothing and go before God and meet the same judge and end up in the same courtroom at the end. All people have the same end point. You do not get to think that you're different. You are allowed to think that you're different. You would be stupid, but you can if you want to. You're still going to die. You need to get ready. You're going to die, so even though you don't know when, be ready for it. It's going to come in the future. All people die. That's one important truth about death that we learned from, that we are reminded of in The Rich Man and Lazarus. The second thing we're reminded of is that the afterlife does exist. That would be verse 23. In Hades, the rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades he raised his eyes. Wait a second, I thought he died. Well, yeah, he did. But death isn't the end. There's something else that's after that. There is Hades for him. Abraham with Lazarus in his arms, or Lazarus in his bosom. There's a comfort there. There's a nice side of things, and there's a nasty side of things. We'll talk about that. That's point number 3. Point number 2 is that the afterlife does exist. Don't be an afterlife denier, right? Death is real. Death is an end, but death is not the end, and we need to be very aware of that. Yes, death is a real thing. No, it is not forever, because there is something after it. And even though I don't know the exact specifications of everything that's after it, I do know that there is something after it. We don't always have a clear picture of what that looks like, but we do know there is something. Be getting ready for that. The afterlife exists, and that's something you're reminded of with the rich man and Lazarus. Number 3, you're reminded that you have 2 options in the afterlife, also in verse 23, in Hades versus in Abraham's bosom. In other words, to make that a little more generic, something good versus something bad. Hades is not hell. It's not the same thing. Hell is active torment. Hades is just the realm of the dead. He is in Hades. It says he is in torment, and so maybe there's some interplay between the two ideas there. Basically, if Jesus had meant hell specifically, he would have said hell instead of Hades, and so I'm sure he's drawing some distinction there, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. Basically, the picture is there's a bad place that you can end up, and there's a good place that you can end up. You don't want to end up in the bad place. That's where the rich man is. You don't want to end up like him. You don't want to be in Hades or in hell. You don't want to be in the place of torment, however extreme that is or however much that looks like. Why would you want to be in torment when you could be in comfort with Abraham or with God or in heaven or however you want to term that one? I don't know, and I don't care. Are these waiting rooms the real thing? I don't know. I'm unsure. I would say no, especially not nowadays. I would just default to no. This is probably not exactly what it looks like. But does it still communicate the exact same thing as if you think these are hell and heaven? Yeah, pretty much. There's a good place to end up, there's a bad place to end up, and that's ultimately your choice. You get to end up in one of those two places. Even if it's Hades and Abraham's bosom for a moment, it'll be heaven and hell forever, right? Those are your ultimate destinations. Whatever you think of the literality of the golden streets or the literality of a fiery darkness, which cannot literally happen, but somehow that's what hell is. It is a place of darkness, and it's a place of fire. I don't know how those can coexist, but good luck figuring that one out. Maybe those are real. Maybe those are literal. Maybe those are just metaphors for how it's going to feel like. I'm on that camp, but, you can disagree with that. Whatever, something good and something bad. Both are attainable for you. You get to pick either one. You get to be where you want to. Heaven or hell. Hades or Abraham's bosom. Comfort or torment. You get to make that choice. And ultimately, that's number 4, right? All people die. The afterlife does exist. You have 2 options in the afterlife. And number 4 is your choices determine where you end up. They determine your end. The rich man is suffering. It says so in verse 25. He says to... Wait a second. It says so in verse 24, my bad. Abraham, have mercy on me. Send me Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. Number 1, that's not really going to do anything, but, anything to make you feel better in the moment, rich man, right? That's it. That's basically what it is. But why is this happening? Abraham says in verse 25, during your life you received your good things, and Lazarus received bad things. Well, now he's being comforted, and now you're in agony. The rich man is suffering. Why? It's because he did stuff like verses 19 through 21. There was a rich man, he habitually dressed in purple, that's very nice, and fine linen, also very nice, enjoying himself in splendor, that's very nice, every single day, that's pretty nice. And then there was this poor man named Lazarus, covered in sores, he's laid at his gate, he wants to be fed with scraps, but he can't even get that, and the dogs have to come and comfort him. Lazarus had nothing in this world. The rich man did evil. The rich man chose to glorify himself and keep everything for himself instead of helping the poor. Now, this is a specific dig at the Pharisees in verse 14, who are lovers of money, listening to the things of Jesus, ridiculing him or mocking him or whatever it is, what have you. This is a man who has everything in the world and keeps it all for himself. It's selfish. And then he's surprised when he doesn't end up in a good place at the end of life. Lazarus isn't really the focus of this. Lazarus ends up in comfort and, don't really know why. Lazarus, at the very least, never stole anything. He didn't complain. Sounds like, I would assume he's just a baseline faithful, and so he ends up with Abraham or whatever that situation is, but that's not really the point. The point is not to focus on Lazarus. The point is the situation of the rich man and Lazarus have been reversed. The ones who were selfish and unwilling to bless others receive curses and end up in a very bad place. The rich man being sent to Hades, in other words, it's not an accident. It happened because he was caring for himself, and he looked at Lazarus and said, nah, and didn't do anything to help him. It is a result of the choice he made. What choices did you make? Have you made choices that are going to send you to Hades or to hell or to torment or whatever it is? Or have you made choices that send you to the good version of that? The heaven, the Abraham's bosom, the paradise, the comfort that there is. How you live determines where you end up on the other side. You get to choose. So I don't really care what terms you use for it. Hades or hell, I know they're different, but for the sake of the general picture, they end up being the same thing. They're both bad. You don't want those. Have you made choices to end up there? God doesn't want you to make those choices. Be wise. It is true, however you end up terming it. Make wise and righteous decisions, or the other side is going to be very unpleasant. Your choices determine your end. That's point number 4. Point number 5 is that death solidifies your choice. That's in verse 26. Abraham says, no, Lazarus isn't going to come over and help you. You deserve what you got. He also says, and besides all this, verse 26, between us and you a great chasm has been set, so that those who want to go over from here to you will not be able, nor will any people cross over from there to us. Even if Lazarus wanted to go and help you, he can't do it. And even if you wanted to come into the nice place, you can't do that either. Number 5, death solidifies your choice. You get to make a choice on where you end up, but wherever you end up, you do not get to cross over to the other one. Various religious groups, Catholics, will preach a doctrine called something like purgatory, where I believe the idea is that a human being who has sinned in lifetime will go to a hell-like place where you burn in torment for a while, and then after you burn in torment for a while, God has basically exacted all his vengeance for those sins, and so you've had enough problems, you've suffered enough, and then you get to go to heaven. That is not real. Different religious groups try to preach that. I know that Catholics do. I feel like Orthodox probably do. If the Catholics do it, they're pretty similar. Episcopalian is probably pretty similar. I don't know about a lot of the other Protestant groups. I haven't researched every individual schematic of how all of that has ended up. But I know that a lot of people believe in some kind of purgatory where there are people who are bad but not entirely lost. Hate to break it to you. God says there are 2 results. One of them is heaven, one of them is hell. And between one of them is Hades, one of them is Abraham's bosom. And between the 2 of them, there is a great chasm or a great gulf that is fixed, and no one can cross over. I don't believe in purgatory. There's nothing in the Bible that supports it, and there's stuff like this that doesn't support it. You're either in heaven or you're in hell. You're either with God or you're not. If you're with God, you've been forgiven. You don't have sins to be punished of. If you have sins, if you are not with God, you're not with God. You're going to hell, right? There are two options. There is no third. There is no, you're kind of in the middle and you'll end up okay. No, no, no. The bad place before heaven is not real. Don't waste time believing in that. There is a divide between the two sides, and the divide is complete. And once you have made a choice, once you have died, your choice is solidified, and you cannot switch over to the other side. So be careful what you choose. You do have an opportunity to get it right, but it won't last forever. And once you die, you don't get to second guess yourself at that point. God is gracious to allow you the choice. Do not begrudge him for putting a time limit on the choice. That's just how it is. Everyone's welcome to turn to him if they want to, but it's ultimately up to how every individual person chooses to live his or her life. And yes, there are only two. Number six, truth that you learn about hell or about death is that even the faithless ones hate where they end up. Verse 24, have mercy on me, send Lazarus, I'm in agony in this flame. Verses 27 and 28, the rich man says, look, I request of you, Father Abraham, that you send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them so that they will not come to this place of torment as well. Some people claim, I've had somebody do this to me, actually, to my face. That was fun. That's not a parable. That's a real thing that's happened. I have had someone claim that even if God exists, it will give me great joy to be able to spit in his face, I believe is how he phrased it, in the end. Basically, even if I'm right, he was an atheist, didn't believe in God, at least not anymore. He had fallen out of it when he was young. Granted, he had a bunch of terrible early life experiences and was in a false denomination that was teaching a lot of the wrong things. So I understand why. Hearing some of what he went through, I understand why he rejected that. Still, he used that as an excuse to reject God entirely, which is incorrect. And his claim was, even if God exists and even if you're right, I'll enjoy saying no to him. I'll enjoy rejecting the offer. I'll enjoy spitting in his face and ignoring what he gave. And that conversation, that was a terrible conversation to have, but that conversation had me thinking about this, because this is quite the opposite. There are a lot of people who claim they have this sense of bravado about facing God in the end, and they think that when they get to heaven, or when they get to the judgment day, they're not going to heaven. They're very confident in that because they don't believe it, and even if it does exist, they are very confident that God will not accept them. And they're very excited to proclaim that, even if God exists, it just gives me an opportunity to mock him and refuse his offer one more time, and how satisfying that will be. But when people end up in torment on the other side of things, that sentiment is not going to last very long. The rich man shows up in Hades, and he's there for about 2 minutes before he starts to say, "This is awful. What have I done?" And even more telling than that, too few people recognize how terrible it is to really be rejected by God. The rich man, when he's sitting there, is just trying to save himself, and when he can't save himself, he tries to save his family. It's noble. It's a little too late for that, for him. But it's telling that the rich man would rather his family be in heaven than have them accompany him to hell, even if they could comfort him there, even if he would have other people that he knew to spend some time with. He would just rather them be in heaven and not have to suffer the things that he is suffering. It is quite telling to me. As you go through the Bible, as you think about the things that Satan does, Satan never glorifies hell. There's some weird people these days who glorify hell, and they say hell is the greatest place because it's outside of God's control or whatever like that. Not even Satan believes that. at least not enough to say it. He doesn't glorify hell. All he does is try and distract you from heaven. Because hell is not anyone's ideal destination. Hell is not the realm of Satan where Satan rules. It's where Satan was kicked out to. It's the absence of God. It is depravity to every level, and not in a way that you would enjoy. Hell is not the ideal destination, and even those who think they will enjoy it will be thrown there and very quickly realize how bad it really is. So much so that they would want to get over to the other side, or so much so they would beg their friends not to join them. But they've dragged their friends to hell already. Think how terrible it would be to have all your other friends show up in hell and then realize you were the one who brought them there, and now you all suffer in torment for eternity together. Wonderful, isn't it? Even the faithless ones, even the haters of God, or just the ignorers of God, the ones who just didn't care, they don't end up liking hell either. If you're one of those people, or you find yourself identifying as one of those people, be careful about that. You will not like where that decision goes. Tried to tell that to my friend. He didn't listen at that moment. I hope he's come around since. I don't know. Number 7. Let's go through all 7, just so that they're in your mind again. Number 1, everyone dies. Number 2, the afterlife exists. It's real. Number 3, you have 2 options where you end up. Number 4, your choices determine where you end up. Number 5, death solidifies that choice. You can't make it. You can't change your mind after death. Number 6, the people in hell will hate it. The faithless hate their fate. And number 7, the good thing is God is given the opportunity. That's the end of the chapter, verses 29 through 31. Send back Lazarus so that he can, resurrect and warn my brothers. And Abraham says, no, they have all the stuff they need. They have Moses. They have the prophets. In other words, they have the Old Testament. The evidence is there. God has provided for them. Let them hear them. My man, the rich man, says, no, Abraham, you're dumb. You don't understand. They're not going to listen to an old book, but they'll listen if someone rises from the dead. And what Abraham says is, look, human faith is a powerful thing, and it is a powerful thing for good, or it is a powerful thing for evil. The evidence is there. In the Old Testament, Jesus living at this point would be referring to the Old Testament. Nowadays, when we think about this, we can just add the, post-crucifixion, we can add the New Testament in as well. We have plenty of evidence of what God has done, but people, when confronted by it, ignore it anyways. And honestly, even if you were to show people miracles, how many people believe today? Even if you were to show someone a miracle, how many people would still shrug their shoulders and ignore it? How many people did it back in Jesus' day? How many people do it in ours? How many people in this world experience something that is maybe supernatural, or at least unidentifiable? We have no idea what's going on or what causes what. And then they say, well, we know it can't have been God. You have no idea. But how many people just deny it because they have their preconceived notions? Even if they're shown miracles, how many people disbelieve those anyway? See, the human mind is an incredibly powerful tool. And it can be used for good, and it can be used for evil. If someone does not believe, it doesn't matter what you show them, they will refuse to believe. If someone does believe, it doesn't matter what you show them, they will refuse not to believe. I think I said that right. If someone automatically doesn't believe, you're not going to convince them otherwise. If someone automatically believes, you're also not going to convince them otherwise. Because ultimately, those who want to believe something will do so, regardless of all evidence to the contrary. It's an unfortunate truth. It leaves those who are the honest seekers, people who are actually open. Someone who may believe one thing, or they may think very strongly in one opinion, but if you show them evidence, they are willing to consider it and maybe even sway and change their minds to find the truth. The ones who are the honest seekers are very few, even among Christians. A lot of atheists are automatically against God no matter what you point out about the truth of his existence. A lot of Christians are automatically for God, and they assume God's existence, even though they don't know how. They don't know why. They don't have any evidence to back that up. They haven't thought about these things. They haven't experimented with this. They haven't even tried on a world in which God doesn't exist. They haven't considered the alternatives. It's not necessarily good. We're looking for people who are honest seekers, who are willing to consider the things that God has said, to see if they are true or not, see if they are the things that God has said. Consider the things of science and see if they are true. Consider the things of the Bible and see if they are true. Consider the things of religion and see if they are true. Only when you have honest seekers will they look and really find the truth. I believe God has given us an option to look. He's given us plenty, Moses and the prophets, and now Jesus and the new prophets, right? He's given us the Old and the New Testaments. He's preserved the Bible for us. But it's up to us whether we actually look at that with a mind to try and figure out whether it's true or not. And you get to come up with the answer to that. Just know that if God exists, and he does, he will judge you according to how you treated his word. So have you looked at what God's offered? It's truth. It is plain and simple. Of course, I'm not going to advocate against God. I don't believe it. I believe God, and I believe I have very good reasons for it, because I've tried to investigate, and I've tried to put myself on the other side of things and believe that God doesn't exist. I just can't bring myself to, because there aren't really answers for nature if God doesn't exist. God's the only one who provides the satisfactory solution. So that's what that's the opportunity that you have as well. Have you looked at what God's offered you? It's the truth, and that is plain and simple. I don't really care if you look at the story and say that it is a parable, it's all made up, and it's meant to enforce those ideas and remind you of some truths about death. I don't really care if you say this is a true story that actually happened, and Lazarus is a real person who died. Because, we know a guy named Lazarus. He was one of Jesus' friends, and he died for a little bit in John 11, or maybe it's 12. I think it's 11. I don't remember. He died for a little bit there, and that's what Jesus is referring to. I very much don't believe that, but I don't really care if you do. The same points shine through either way, because you still see the truth about death. You have a limited time. You, your friends, and your family, you have a limited time to get things right. And you need to make sure you are right. So don't delay. Seek righteousness for yourself and seek it for other people as well, because it will be worth it. Even if you're kind of unsure here on the earth, by the time you get over to paradise and heaven, you'll realize that that was the right decision, because torment is not going to be pleasant for anybody, not even Satan. That's where we'll leave it today. Rich Man and Lazarus on Wednesday. There's a class coming out about the Old Testament, how to read the Bible, specifically dealing with Old Testament laws for that section. And after that, on Friday, I'll be preaching the next section of the Sermon on the Mount. So I will see you then.